In the spring of 1942, deep in the forests near the village of Khmelevy in western Russia, a Soviet reconnaissance patrol from the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment made an extraordinary discovery. What they found would become one of the most remarkable stories of World War II, a story of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond between soldiers and a child who would become the youngest combatant of the entire war. The soldiers almost didn't see him. Huddled against a tree, barely conscious, covered in dirt and insects, was a tiny figure. At first, they thought it was a doll someone had discarded. Then the doll moved. It was a small boy, no more than 6 years old, emaciated and near death. Sergeant Major Mikhail Vorobyov was the first to reach the child. When he picked him up, the boy weighed almost nothing. His eyes were huge in his tiny face, but they were empty, hollow. The soldiers thought he might die right there in their arms. They had no idea who this child was, where he had come from, or how long he had been alone in the wilderness. What they would soon learn was a story of unimaginable tragedy. The boy's name was Sergei Aleshkov. Just months earlier, he had been living an ordinary life with his mother and older brother in a small village in the Kaluga region. He was 5 years old, playing, learning, dreaming as children do. But in 1942, the war came to his village with terrible fury. German forces had invaded the Soviet Union the previous year, and by 1942, they were sweeping through western Russia with devastating force. Partisan activity in the region had made the occupiers brutal and paranoid. Any village suspected of harboring resistance fighters faced collective punishment without mercy. Sergei's mother was accused of aiding Soviet partisans. Whether the accusation was true or false didn't matter. It was a death sentence. German soldiers arrived at their home. What happened next would haunt Sergei for the rest of his life. His mother was executed. His older brother was killed. 6-year-old Sergei managed to hide, frozen in terror as his world collapsed around him. When the soldiers finally left, he emerged to find himself utterly, devastatingly alone. A 6-year-old child, orphaned and traumatized, wandered into the vast Russian wilderness. He had no food, no shelter, no understanding of how to survive. For days, perhaps weeks, Sergei stumbled through the forests. He ate whatever he could find: berries, roots, bark. He grew weaker with each passing day. The cold bit deeper. By the time the Soviet soldiers found him, he was dying. But the soldiers of the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment faced an impossible dilemma. They were in active combat operations, moving constantly, fighting German forces daily. They couldn't leave the boy behind. He would certainly die. But taking a 6-year-old into combat seemed equally impossible. How could they protect a child in the middle of a war? Major Mikhail Vorobyov, the regiment's chief of reconnaissance, made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The regiment would keep the boy. They would protect him, care for him, and somehow, impossibly, keep him alive in the middle of the most brutal conflict in human history. The soldiers named him their son of the regiment, a title with deep meaning in Russian military tradition. Throughout the Eastern Front, Soviet units sometimes adopted orphaned children, giving them purpose and protection in a world that had taken everything from them. But Sergei was different. At 6 years old, he was among the youngest children ever to be taken in by a military unit. Soldiers pooled their meager rations to feed him. They found him clothes, cutting down uniforms to fit his tiny frame. They washed him, cared for his wounds, and spoke to him gently. Slowly, painfully, Sergei began to speak again. He had been silent for so long. The trauma had nearly stolen his voice, but surrounded by these rough, battle-hardened men who treated him with unexpected tenderness, he began to heal. And remarkably, Sergei didn't just survive with the regiment, he became part of it. He became a working member of the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment, contributing to their mission in ways no one could have predicted. The soldiers couldn't keep Sergei idle in camp. The Eastern Front was too dangerous, too fluid. Besides, the boy wanted to help. He had lost everything to the Germans. In his child's mind, staying with these soldiers meant staying alive, and helping them meant striking back at those who had destroyed his family. So they gave him tasks appropriate to his size and age. Sergei became a runner and messenger. His small size became a tactical advantage. He could move through trenches quickly, slip through tight spaces that adult soldiers couldn't navigate, and draw less attention than a full-grown soldier moving across open ground. He carried messages between positions, delivered mail from the rear that kept soldiers connected to their families, and brought water and food to men in forward positions who couldn't leave their posts. The men loved him. In the brutal grind of the Eastern Front, where death was constant and hope was scarce, this little boy became a symbol of what they were fighting for. He reminded them of their own children, their own families, their own humanity. Every time they looked at Sergei, they remembered why they endured the cold, the hunger, the fear, and the endless violence. They were fighting so that other children wouldn't suffer as this one had. But Sergei was more than a mascot or a symbol. His contribution to the regiment went far beyond morale. On one occasion, in late 1942, his quick thinking and courage directly saved the lives of several officers, including the man who had become his adopted father. It was during the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The 142nd Guards Regiment was engaged in brutal urban combat, fighting house to house, room to room against German forces. Major Vorobyov had established a temporary headquarters in a reinforced bunker. German artillery had been pounding their positions for hours, the earth shaking with each impact. During a particularly intense bombardment, disaster struck. The bunker took a direct hit from a large-caliber shell. The entrance collapsed completely. Major Vorobyov was inside, injured and trapped, along with several other officers. The bunker was filling with smoke and dust. Without air circulation, they had only minutes to live. Sergei was outside when it happened. While adult soldiers struggled to comprehend the situation and organize a rescue effort in the chaos of ongoing combat, 6-year-old Sergei acted on pure instinct. He knew the major was inside. He knew the major had saved his life. Now it was his turn to save the major. He ran. The boy sprinted through artillery fire, shells exploding around him, toward the nearest Soviet position several hundred meters away. He was screaming for help, his small voice somehow cutting through the thunder of battle. Soldiers saw this tiny figure running toward them through the smoke and explosions and thought they were hallucinating. But Sergei was real, and his message was urgent. He led soldiers back to the collapsed bunker, guiding the rescue effort with desperate urgency, pointing, explaining, refusing to leave despite the danger. The soldiers dug frantically, racing against time. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Then, impossibly, they broke through. Major Vorobyov and the other officers were pulled out, unconscious from smoke inhalation, but alive. Sergei, at 6 years old, had saved his adopted father's life. Word of the incident spread rapidly through the regiment, then through the division, and eventually to higher command. The story of the 6-year-old boy who saved his commanding officer under artillery fire became legend Throughout the Red Army, Soviet propaganda officials learned of it and recognized its power. Here was a story of courage, of sacrifice, of Soviet determination embodied in the smallest, most unlikely soldier imaginable. Vorobyov and his family were patient and understanding. They didn't try to make Sergei forget his experiences. That would have been impossible and perhaps even harmful. Instead, they helped him process what he had been through. They acknowledged his trauma while gently guiding him toward healing. They enrolled him in school, where teachers were instructed to be sensitive to his background. They encouraged him to play with other children, to make friends, to discover the world beyond war and death. It took years. The trauma of losing his birth family, of witnessing their murder, of living through years of war at such a tender age. These scars never fully healed. They couldn't. But Sergei learned to live with them. He learned to manage his nightmares. He learned to trust again. He learned to smile, to laugh, to hope. He learned to dream of a future that extended beyond the next battle, the next meal, the next day of survival. And remarkably, Sergei proved to be a brilliant student. He excelled academically, driven by the same fierce determination that had kept him alive during the war. He had an exceptional memory, sharp analytical skills, and an intense work ethic. Perhaps most importantly, he developed a profound passion for law and justice. This passion wasn't accidental. It grew directly from his experiences. He had witnessed the ultimate injustice, the murder of innocents, the destruction of communities, the casual cruelty of war. He had seen what happened when law and order collapsed, when might made right, when there was no one to protect the weak. He had been that weak person, that child with no protection, and only the random chance of being found by good men had saved him. He wanted to build a world where children wouldn't suffer as he had, where families wouldn't be destroyed by violence, where justice meant something more than the barrel of a gun. Law became his calling, his mission, his way of continuing to fight for what was right. Sergei worked tirelessly through his education. He graduated from secondary school with top honors, then entered university to study law. His professors remembered him as intense, focused, passionate about justice and human rights. He wrote papers on the protection of civilians in wartime, on the rights of children, on the prosecution of war crimes. His personal experiences gave his academic work a depth and urgency that his classmates couldn't match. He graduated from university with honors and began his career as a lawyer in the Soviet legal system. For decades, he dedicated himself to serving others, particularly the vulnerable. He took on cases defending ordinary citizens against bureaucratic abuse. He advocated for veterans who had been forgotten by the system. He worked to ensure that orphans and displaced children received proper care. In his own quiet way, he continued the mission that had begun when soldiers of the 142nd Guards Regiment decided to save one small boy. Sergei married and had children of his own. He was, by all accounts, a loving father who was deeply protective of his children, but also encouraged their independence and strength. He made sure they knew their history, his history, but he also made sure they had the happy, peaceful childhood that had been stolen from him. Throughout his life, Sergei remained close to Mikhail Vorobyov until the major's death. They were father and son in every way that mattered, not through blood, but through choice, through love forged in the crucible of war. Vorobyov attended Sergei's graduation, his wedding, the births of his children. They spent holidays together. They talked regularly. The bond formed in that forest in 1942 never broke. Vorobyov never let Sergei forget where he came from, not to cause pain, but to honor memory. He wanted Sergei to remember the soldiers who had shared their rations with a starving boy, who had carried him when he was too weak to walk, who had sung him to sleep when artillery thundered in the distance, who had risked their lives to keep him safe. Many of those men had died in the war. Vorobyov believed they deserved to be remembered, and Sergei agreed. Sergei attended reunions of the 142nd Guards Regiment for decades. He wore his medals proudly, not as a boast, but as a badge of belonging. He was part of something larger than himself, part of a brotherhood that had saved his life and given him purpose when he had nothing left. He told his story to anyone who would listen, not for glory or attention, but for memory and meaning. He wanted people, especially young people, to understand what war really was. Not the glorified version shown in films, but the reality. The hunger, the cold, the terror, the random death, the destruction of innocence. He wanted them to understand what it cost, what it took, what it did to millions like him. In interviews later in life, Sergei spoke about his experiences with remarkable clarity and emotion. He remembered the names of dozens of soldiers who had cared for him. He remembered their faces, their voices, their kindnesses. He remembered the cold of Russian winters in a dugout. He remembered the taste of military rations. He remembered the fear of artillery barrages. He remembered finding his mother's body. But he also remembered the laughter of soldiers telling jokes to lift spirits. He remembered being taught to read by candlelight. He remembered the songs they sang. He remembered the feeling of Major Vorobyov's hand on his shoulder, solid and reassuring. He remembered that even in the worst of human cruelty, there was kindness. Even in hell, there was humanity. Sergei Aleshkov passed away in 1990 at the age of 54. His death was premature. Perhaps the toll of his early trauma, the stress of his experiences, shortened his life. His passing went largely unnoticed by the wider world. There were no state funerals, no international headlines. He was not a general or a politician. He had not commanded armies or shaped the course of history in obvious way.